Hello everyone, Paudie here, coming to you from my living room to tell you a little bit about St. Patrick as we swiftly approach St. Patrick's Day. What can I say about my namesake, St. Patrick? He was from a small place near what is today Carlisle in Cumbria. I sometimes make the joke in the museum that St. Patrick was from the Valleys. St. Patrick was a Welshman, but this is from a much earlier folk tradition. Most historians today can agree that St. Patrick came from the northwest of England. That's right, a national holiday for an Englishman. I'm as shocked as you are. He arrived in Ireland in the 5th century. Well, I say he arrived, he was taken. He was captured by a guy called Niall of the Nine Hostages. Now, there's an epic name if ever there was one. And Niall was a minor king, but he was also a slaver. And he was raiding up and down the northwest coast of England, and he stole St. Patrick away, sold him, and St. Patrick was placed on the top of a mountain minding some sheep. St. Patrick spent many the cold, hard night on the top of the mountain, but possibly some comfort to him was his faith. St. Patrick's father, Calpurnius, was a deacon of the church, and the family had been very pious, very Christian. And so his faith might have been some comfort to him on those cold, lonely nights at the top of the mountain. But maybe one day the work was just too hard, or maybe one day he felt called away. But St. Patrick escaped. Not an easy thing for a slave to do in ancient Ireland, but somehow he managed it. And with the help of some sailors, he sailed home. And after spending a short time at home, he moved on to France, where he was educated and brought up in the priesthood. One night, while lying alone in his cell, St. Patrick began to hear voices, and we don't know where the voices came from, obviously, but St. Patrick believed that they were the voices of the Irish people calling him back to Ireland to tell them more about this Christianity business. So, as strange as it might seem to some, St. Patrick left behind his comfortable life in France and returned to the country where he had been held captive as a slave. Almost immediately after arriving, St. Patrick began to make a very big splash. And there are a lot of stories set around this time in St. Patrick's life. Probably the most famous is what happened with the Bealtaine of Fires. Bealtaine is a fire festival, and it involves pretty much everybody putting out their fires except for the High King, the Ard Rí. And this fire was then dedicated to the gods. It was big, it was enormous, it was massive, and it was used to purify the herd. Fire was used to purify the herd from ticks and that kind of thing. And St. Patrick thought to himself, well, if I can light a bigger and better fire, perhaps the people will come over to my way of thinking. So on what is today the hill of Slane, if any of you have been to Slane to a music concert, St. Patrick lit an enormous bonfire. And obviously the High King was furious. He was supposed to have the biggest bonfire in Ireland. But the people also noticed that St. Patrick had lit an enormous bonfire, but somehow had managed not to be punished by the ancient gods. So there was very little that the king could do about it. The next stop for St. Patrick was the plain of Magschlecht in County Sligo, and the cult site of Cromdove, the crouching darkness. Cromdove was the only god in ancient Ireland that demanded human sacrifice. His cult idol, his cult statue, was this kind of proto artistic, proto humanistic style, crouching stone thing covered in gold. St. Patrick blew in to the cult site at Magschlecht like a mighty wind, and with one tap of his staff shattered the statue of Crom Dubh, even though it was covered in gold, into thousands of pieces. After Sligo, St. Patrick moved on to County Mayo even, and climbed to the top of what is today called Croagh Patrick, or sometimes also known as the Reek. And at the top of Croagh Patrick, he fasted for 40 days and 40 nights, the usual business. Today, on top of Croagh Patrick, there's a beautiful little chapel, and on the last Sunday in July, lots of people climb it still as a form of pilgrimage. Some people go up barefoot. Now, I can't recommend this because I don't know if you're familiar with that part of the country, but the mountains there aren't grassy hillocks, that's for sure. They are full of pointy rocks. They are stones and pointy rocks. So going up barefoot, I can't recommend it. Some people do it still to this day, and maybe after a few jars, I claimed to have done it too. But what is very rewarding about the climb, aside from the spiritual aspect of it, is the beautiful view at the top of the whole of the glorious county Connacht. And St. Patrick had managed to do something, and before people think, well, St. Patrick was the first Christian in Ireland. That's not true. The church had made various inroads to the country before, and it had even elected a bishop, but the problem was that nobody before St. Patrick was very successful. It needed that kind of Christianity needed that kind of charismatic figure, that kind of wild man who has spent night after night at the top of a mountain, who's a bit of a heretic, who's a bit mad, who the obituaries would describe as he didn't suffer fools gladly, and that's a very nice way of putting it. He wasn't an easy man to work with in any sense, St. Patrick, and he managed to explain the Trinity by using the shamrock. The shamrock is a relative of the clover plant. It has one little sproutling and 3 leaves sprouting off of it. It has become the symbol of Ireland. If you've ever flown Aer Lingus, you've seen it there on the tail wing. And basically, it's 3 leaves on one plant. 3 leaves on one sproutling. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, 3 in 1, like the Christian Trinity. But there is absolutely no historical evidence that St. Patrick used the shamrock to explain the Trinity. But he, I think it was probably more to do with his personality, but he managed where the church had failed before in being very successful at converting people to Christianity. The king in Cashel, the Rock of Cashel there, at the kingly site there, the king in Cashel had heard that the Christianity business was all the rage on the continent, and so he sent for Ireland's most charismatic Christian to come and tell him more. St. Patrick converted the king in no time at all, and together they planned a baptism. Now, the king was very sensitive to the fact that he would remain the king of thousands of pagans. So they planned the baptism in such a way that the king would bow down in front of the holy well, the wishing well, what was for the pagans essentially the entranceway into the home of their gods. St. Patrick would see the well as nothing more than a baptismal font. St. Patrick, as I said, was a bit of a wild man, a bit of a heretic, went into a bit of a trance as he was performing the baptism. He also had a crozier. Now, a crozier is a little bit like a shepherd's crook in that it has the twirly bit at the top, but it also has a spike at the other end. This is so that the bishop can drive it into the ground. St. Patrick drove the crozier into what he thought was the ground, but was actually the king's foot. When St. Patrick emerged from his trance, he saw blood everywhere, naturally, and said to the king, "Why didn't you cry out? Why didn't you say something?" To which the king replied, "I thought it was all part of the ceremony." That'll give you a glimpse or a look into how tough the kings were in ancient Ireland. How do we know so much? You'll notice that I have a lot of information on St. Patrick. How do we know so much? Well, he wrote a book called the Confessio, or the Confession. Now, why is it called the Confession? A couple of reasons, but probably the most important is that St. Patrick was accused by the church back on the continent, in what is a very modern story, of embezzling church funds. And he wrote a book to defend himself. So I'll summarize it for you. It's essentially the money was only resting in my account, for all of you Father Ted fans out there. But it is a very interesting read and riveting in some parts, because it is the life of St. Patrick. And I always think it's great that you can pick up a book and say, "Oh, St. Patrick wrote this kind of near mythical figure." You can pick up a book that they wrote and read their words as they intended them. Now, there's one thing we must get out of the way, and that is the snakes business. Every child raised in Ireland knows that St. Patrick got rid of the snakes. Look around Ireland, you'll notice there are no snakes, and coincidentally, there have been no snakes since the last glacial period. Interesting. Where does this come from? Thankfully, St. Patrick getting rid of the snakes isn't taught in our history classes. One theory, and there are numerous theories, one theory is that very popular in the 5th century in Ireland was a religious cult called the cult of the horned serpent. They were very body positive, very sex positive, and St. Patrick was a bit of a prude. So he went out of his way to stamp them out, and basically completely eradicated that cult from Ireland. This is possibly one of the reasons that it is said he got rid of the snakes from Ireland. The other possible origin of it is that every saint coming up in a pagan country had to do battle with one of that country's famous monsters. This is because the monsters were sometimes worshipped as old-style gods, and so to prove your credentials, essentially, you had to defeat that old style of paganism. And there was one really important type of monster in Ireland at the time, and that is, of course, the banished. Enormous serpents, worms, I suppose you could say, that would wrap themselves around mountains, beside lakes, or at the bottom of very, very deep places. St. Patrick did battle with the banished in Donegal, and the banished in Donegal became so terribly frightened that it ran away. But it was so large and so big that it cut a new course for the River Shannon, which is one folk explanation for why the River Shannon is the longest river in these islands, because essentially the banished, in its panic, in its attempt to escape, swerved around so much that the Shannon became very long. And while St. Patrick was in that part of the world, in County Donegal, he was met by Christ on the road, and St. Patrick was then taken by Christ to a cave, and they went down into the cave, and in the cave St. Patrick was given a vision of the underworld. He was allowed to see into the afterlife, to see purgatory and hell. This was so that as St. Patrick went preaching around Ireland, he could describe to people what would happen to them in the afterlife with first-hand knowledge. You can visit that part of the world today. It's called St. Patrick's Purgatory. It's on an island in a lake, naturally, in what sounds like an Irish folk song. It's it's a very luminous kind of place. You feel really connected to nature there and to the universe, and a real spiritual sense comes over you. Some people do awful things to their bodies there, depriving themselves and punishing themselves because they are searching for some kind of self-discipline. I can't recommend that naturally, but it is well worth the visit if you need that in your life, if you're at that stage of your life. Now, to wrap up, St. Patrick died on March 17th, supposedly, which is why his holiday is on March 17th. The other explanation is that the Irish were given a holiday in the middle of Lent because the church knew that the Irish wouldn't be able to make it from the start of Lent to the end of Lent without having some kind of a festival with drink. I don't know if that's true, but it is historically the reason why March 17th happens in the middle of Lent is that's when St. Patrick died. But interestingly, St. Patrick died at Armagh, which is why today the centre for Roman Catholicism on the island of Ireland is in Northern Ireland, even though the majority of Catholics live in the Republic. And some beautiful poetry and beautiful songs have come out of that centre of worship. I would really recommend you read St. Patrick's Breastplate. It's quite self-affirming, and for those who are spiritually inclined, it's a great way to start the day. I arise today through the strength of heaven. I hope you enjoyed listening to me tell you everything I knew about St. Patrick, and I hope you have a lovely St. Patrick's Day. I hope you feel very proud of your Irish connections on St. Patrick's Day, and I really enjoyed talking to you about St. Patrick, and I hope you have a fabulous day. Over and out.